It began on an ordinary summer evening in a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where streetlights hummed softly at dusk, and the air still held the warmth of the day long after the sun slipped behind the tree line. It was August of 2002, late enough in the season that families had settled into their predictable end-of-summer routines, early enough that children were still squeezing out the last fragments of freedom before school pulled them back into order. Nothing marked that night as different. Nothing hinted at the rupture it was about to carve into the lives of two families who had believed the world they lived in was safe, predictable, and built on the kind of everyday innocence that should have protected their children. But innocence has never been armor, and on that night, two boys vanished along quiet streets only miles apart. No struggle, no witnesses, no sound, just the soft, unbearable fact of absence. The first was a boy who loved bicycles, the kind who kept his handlebars wrapped in bright tape. He replaced himself even when they didn't need it. He rode the same loop every evening before dark, a ritual that steadied him, a pattern that let his mother glance out the window and know he was fine as long as she saw the arc of his movement past the mailbox. The second was a boy who preferred walking, slow and deliberate, counting cracks in the pavement as if each one anchored him to the rhythm of the world. They did not know each other. They had never met. But by the time the sun rose the next morning, their names would be spoken together on police radios, in living rooms, and at kitchen tables, where parents clutched photographs and prayed for reasons that refused to come. Both disappeared into the same kind of silence. A silence that felt intentional, designed. The first boy left home just after dinner, telling his mother he would circle the block once or twice before coming in to finish a school project. She watched him go from the doorway, the soft thump of the screen door marking his departure. He wore his favorite shirt, the one he refused to throw away, even though the sleeves were frayed. The last glimpse she caught of him was the silver flash of spokes turning beneath the street lamp. The second boy stepped out of his house around the same time, saying he wanted to return a borrowed video game to a friend who lived half a mile away. He carried it tucked under his arm, careful not to drop it. He was the kind of child who noticed everything: the call of crickets, the faint hum of passing cars, and the way warm air shifted when night crept in at the edges. But even he did not notice whatever waited for him along that short walk. That night, the town settled into its usual quiet. Backyards dimmed. Mailboxes stood like dark outlines against the last pale strip of sky. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance, then fell silent. Midnight came and went, without anyone realizing the shape of the world had already changed. It wasn't until one mother opened her son's bedroom door and saw his bed untouched that the first thread of dread began to pull. She searched the yard, the driveway, and the block. She called his name, her voice rising with each repetition. The second mother called her neighbor, then her son's friend, then the police. She checked the garage 3 times, as if he might have curled up somewhere she had forgotten to look. Both mothers described the same sensation in those first hours, the sense that something was slightly off, like a picture frame knocked askew or a window left open that shouldn't be. But beneath that small imbalance, a deeper realization: the world they trusted was no longer holding. Police arrived quickly at both homes. Officers walked the boys' routes with flashlights slicing through the dark, their beams flattening into pale circles against fences and hedges. They called to the boys, listened to the quiet swallow their voices, and felt the first weight of something they could not yet name. Before dawn, volunteers gathered. Someone brought coffee, someone brought maps, and someone said the sentence that would return again and again in the coming weeks. They couldn't have gotten far. But by sunrise, it was clear distance wasn't the problem. Time was. The first boy's bicycle was found at the edge of a narrow alley, standing upright, wheels still spinning faintly, as if someone had stepped off only seconds before. No skid marks, no fallen chain, no sign of a struggle, just the bike, waiting. The second boy's borrowed game was discovered in the gutter near a stop sign 2 blocks from his home. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't dropped in haste. It appeared to have been placed, A detective would later describe that detail as the thing that kept him awake long after the case turned cold. Both scenes were too clean, too controlled. As if someone understood the world of these boys intimately, their habits, their roots, and their safe places, and used that knowledge to carve a path into their lives without leaving a trace behind. When officers compared notes later that morning, a quiet unease threaded through the conversation. Two boys, same age, same night, same silence. Coincidence felt like too fragile a word to hold that truth. But without evidence, without witnesses, without anything concrete to anchor an investigation, coincidence became the placeholder word no one wanted to use, but everyone was forced to write in their reports. In the days that followed, the search expanded. Helicopters circled overhead. Dogs traced paths that evaporated at intersections. Flyers spread across gas stations, grocery stores, and church bulletin boards. Parents clung to hope with fingers that shook from exhaustion and fear. But hope without direction is a thin rope to hold. And by the end of the second week, investigators began to face a reality they could not yet bring themselves to say out loud. Two boys had disappeared into the same kind of silence. And somewhere in that silence was a door no one could find. Yet, by the morning after the second disappearance, the county had begun to feel like a place holding its breath. Patrol cars traced the same loops through identical neighborhoods, deputies marking down details that felt more symbolic than useful. It was the same community, the same roads, the same trees bending toward the highway, yet everything felt shifted, as if the world had tilted a few degrees when the boys vanished into it. The families lived only 7 miles apart, yet suddenly found themselves connected by a kind of grief neither wanted to acknowledge. Investigators arranged to meet both sets of parents privately, not in the station but in their own homes, hoping the familiarity of a kitchen table, a living room lamp, or the faint smell of dinner from the night before might soften the shock. It rarely did. The first parents sat stiffly, hands folded, their eyes flicking repeatedly toward their son's empty bedroom. They were asked the same questions as before. Did he have new friends, new habits, or new fears? And answered with the same disbelief. Their boy was steady, predictable, and ordinary. The second parents tried to speak, but their voices cracked halfway through every sentence. A detective scribbled notes, while another scanned the walls for anything out of place, as if the answer might be hidden in a photograph frame or behind a crooked calendar. Nothing looked unusual, which somehow made the silence worse. By that afternoon, both disappearances were officially linked in the sheriff's case file. The entry was stamped in red, possible connection pattern unknown. It was the first time the department admitted, even quietly, that something beyond coincidence might be unfolding. The captain called in off-duty staff, and the department's largest missing person search in nearly a decade began to form. Helicopters circled the area. Volunteers lined miles of roadside. School officials prepared notices for families. The air, once thick with late summer heat, now carried a tension that pressed against windows and walls. An analyst assigned to the command post created a timeline on a large whiteboard, filling it with dates, times, and sparse witness accounts. At the top, he wrote 2 names, and beneath them the same haunting line, "Last seen alone." Beneath that, he listed the distances between the boys' final locations as 0.4 miles, as the crow flies, though investigators already knew that geography meant less than time. What mattered was the span of minutes between the boys' known movements and the moment the world lost sight of them. For both, it was less than 2. Detective Halloran, who had been assigned lead investigator, paced behind the board, studying the sequence as if some overlooked detail might suddenly shift into clarity. He was a man with lines etched deep into his forehead, the kind formed not from age, but from years spent listening to people describe the worst nights of their lives. He circled the same stretch of road on the map repeatedly, tapping it with the capped end of his pen. It made no sense. This wasn't an interstate with heavy traffic or a wooded park with dozens of hiding places. It was suburbia. Sidewalks, driveways, trimmed hedges, and porch lights glowing at dusk. Places where everyone believed they were safe simply because they had always been safe before. As the investigation continued, officers canvassed the area for cameras. In 2002, few homes had them, and businesses rarely stored footage longer than a few days. Most cameras offered grainy, grayscale recordings, where shapes dissolved into static. One gas station camera captured a blurry frame of a vehicle passing by within a time frame consistent with one disappearance, but the quality was too poor to identify the make or model. Investigators enhanced it, sharpened it, and even applied early software filters to pull details from the blur. Nothing useful emerged. The vehicle, if it mattered at all, remained a shadow. Door-to-door interviews offered little. A woman watering her garden recalled hearing a car door shut sometime before sunset, but couldn't remember exactly when. A teenage boy claimed he saw a figure near the end of the block, but later admitted he wasn't sure if it was that day or the day before. Human memory, investigators knew, worked like fog. Visible, present, but impossible to grasp with certainty. Still, each detail was logged, cross-checked, and highlighted on the map. Patterns mattered, even when they began as half-formed shapes in the margins. Late in the afternoon, Halloran visited the site of the second disappearance. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the road. A single street lamp hummed softly as insects gathered around it. He stood there for a long moment, imagining the boy's last known steps, the direction he might have looked, and the sound of gravel under his shoes. The world around him remained quiet, disturbingly ordinary. It was astonishing, Halloran thought, how a place could hold the memory of something terrible and look unchanged. People imagined disappearances leaving marks, broken branches, scattered belongings, and tire tracks etched into the dirt. But often the world remained deceptively intact. The only thing missing was the person. Back at the command post, officers studied both boys' patterns, their routes to school, their favorite places, their schedules, and their habits. They were different in many ways. Different families, different interests, but they shared something else investigators could not ignore. Both were predictable. Predictability, Halloran wrote in his notebook, can be safety. But it can also be exposure. Someone who knew the area well, someone who had been watching, might have understood exactly when the boys would be alone and where. As night fell, officers began their second full sweep. Flashlights moved across lawns and along drainage ditches. Deputies knocked softly on doors, mindful of the hour but unwilling to let darkness close the investigation for the night. Halloran returned to the whiteboard, scanning the times once more, narrowing his eyes at the only possible overlap window. It was small, less than 20 minutes, but it existed. This was not random. He felt that certainty settle in his chest like a weight. He stepped outside to clear his head. The parking lot was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. A deputy approached, hesitant. "Sir," he said gently, "both families are asking for updates." Halloran nodded. Updates. That word carried a cruel ambiguity. An update could mean discovery or devastation, and he had neither to offer. Not yet. He walked back inside, took a breath, and prepared himself for the conversations ahead. The night stretched long before him, but he knew its shape. Empty rooms, unanswered questions, and tired parents gripping hope like a fragile object that could shatter under the wrong sentence. It was the beginning of a very long journey through uncertainty, and he understood, even then, that some cases change you from the inside out. This one already had. The search that began in the first frantic hours unfurled across the following days with the kind of urgency that leaves a place changed long after the sound of sirens fades. Doorbells were rung repeatedly, and neighbors interviewed twice, sometimes 3 times, as investigators tried to reconstruct the final steps of 2 boys who had walked familiar ground and then vanished, as if swallowed by the quiet. Officers traced the road out of town, marking tire impressions in damp soil, interviewing anyone who might have glimpsed movement at the hour when daylight softens and shapes blur. A mail carrier remembered seeing 2 figures near a bend, but distance and dusk had turned them into silhouettes more than people. Another resident insisted he heard what sounded like hurried footsteps on gravel, but by the time he looked outside, there was only the thinning light and a gust of wind that stirred the leaves. Neither detail answered anything. The case file swelled quickly, with pages clipped together, maps annotated with arrows and circles, and statements taped to the edges. What troubled detectives most was not what they found, but what they did not. No torn clothing, no dropped belongings. No witness was willing to say they had heard a shout or a struggle. It was as if the world had dipped briefly out of focus, and when it sharpened again, the boys were gone. Parents arrived at the command post each morning, hollow-eyed, their questions looping through the same fragile hope. Did anyone see them? Had there been any call, any sign, any mistake in the timeline? Investigators explained the procedures again, gently, outlining their efforts, with the same words delivered in the same tone, meant to comfort but rarely succeeding. Families waited with hands clasped, staring at the photos pinned to bulletin boards. The school portraits of boys, still smiling in shirts they had long since outgrown. A volunteer printed hundreds of flyers, and by nightfall, they fluttered from every telephone pole and storefront window. People walked the fields in small groups, flashlights cutting thin beams across the grass. They called the boys' names into the dusk, each return of silence carrying its own weight. By the end of the first week, the search radius stretched miles beyond the residential streets, into wooded patches and abandoned properties that most residents rarely glanced at. Deputies entered old sheds and barns with warped doors, the interiors thick with dust and forgotten equipment. Dogs sniffed through bushes and ravines, pausing here and there, but never leading to anything conclusive. Rumors scattered through the community like sparks in dry grass. A stranger's truck was seen near the elementary school weeks before, a man asking odd questions at a gas station, a house on the edge of town where lights stayed on at unusual hours. Detectives cataloged each rumor with patient diligence, checking records, examining license plates, and interviewing tenants. Every lead fizzled within hours. What unsettled the investigative team most was the quiet symmetry. Two boys, around the same age, known to walk the same roads, vanishing in nearly identical fashion within the same span of minutes. It was too precise to be coincidence, yet too clean to offer direction. Crime scenes, even abducted children scenes, usually contain noise, footprints disturbed, eyewitness inconsistencies, and someone remembering too much or too little. Here there was only neatness, as though someone had stepped in lightly, deliberately, careful not to leave behind a single misstep. Detective Harris, a seasoned investigator with 20 years in the department, reviewed the timelines again late one night, tracing the narrow strip of road where both boys had last been confirmed. He circled the same 3 points repeatedly: the bend near the drainage ditch, the vacant lot beside the closed-down hardware store, and the stretch of sidewalk where the footprints tapered into nothing. He wrote a note in the margin: deliberate approach, controlled extraction. It was speculation, nothing more, but it lodged itself into his thoughts. He tried to imagine someone moving through that neighborhood unnoticed, knowing exactly where to stand to remain unseen, knowing when the road would be empty, and knowing when the boys would be alone. It suggested familiarity, or scouting, or both. The mothers grew quieter as the days passed. One of them folded her hands around a mug at the community center and stared at the wall, as though expecting it to open and reveal a door back into the ordinary world. The other walked the same path each morning, tracing her son's route from their front porch to the last confirmed point, whispering his name in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear. People brought food, candles, knitted blankets, anything that felt like comfort, but comfort felt too fragile to hold. Detectives consulted outside agencies by the end of the second week. Specialists in missing children cases reviewed the file and offered insights that were both clinical and unnerving. The lack of physical evidence suggested a level of planning. The short window of opportunity implied surveillance. The absence of witnesses hinted at timing designed to exploit familiarity with the town's rhythms. One specialist used a phrase that stayed with Harris. Whoever did this understood the landscape of attention here. It wasn't meant to be poetic, but it was. In small towns, attention is predictable. People look up at the same time, look away at the same time, and assume safety because they have always been granted it. The investigation shifted into broader territory. Highway patrol officers were asked to review dashcam footage from the nights surrounding the disappearance. Businesses within a 10-mile radius were contacted about any camera systems, though most had none or ones so outdated they recorded only static shapes. There was a single camera in a convenience store near the far edge of town, and investigators played the footage dozens of times. A car passed, a cyclist, a dog wandering loose, but no captured image of the boys. 3 weeks in, the case hit the kind of stillness investigators dread. The kind where every theory has been tested and discarded, where every field has been walked and rewalked. Harris returned home late each night, with the case folder tucked under his arm, its weight both literal and symbolic. He read through reports again, searching for discrepancies that might unlock something overlooked. But the words stayed the same, the timelines unchanged, the silence unbroken. On the 26th day, a town meeting was held at the community hall. Chairs filled quickly, the air tense with questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Parents clutched photographs. Teachers sat with folded hands. Harris stood at the front, delivering the same measured explanations he had repeated for weeks, though he could feel the tide shifting from fear to a quieter form of despair. Someone asked whether they should keep their children indoors. Someone else asked whether the boys were likely still alive. Harris paused before answering, not because he didn't know what to say, but because truth requires careful handling when people are hurting. He told them investigations sometimes take time, that absence does not always mean loss, that cases like these have reopened years later with breakthroughs no one could have predicted. It was not false hope, nor was it certainty. It was the only way to hold the room steady. But outside the hall, as the meeting dispersed and the evening light sank behind rooftops, the wind carried an unspoken acknowledgement. The town had shifted. A boundary had been crossed. The story was no longer simply about 2 missing boys. It had become about the widening space between what was known and what had happened in the moments no one saw. By the 4th week of the investigation, the case had already begun to show the quiet exhaustion that settles over departments when answers refuse to materialize. Detectives cycled through the motions. Phone calls, door knocks, and tip evaluations. But the map on the wall never changed. 2 pins for the boys' homes, 1 for the bike found near the drainage ditch, 1 for the last confirmed sighting. Nothing else. The lines between them remained as thin and unhelpful as the first day they were drawn. Families continued to hold vigils. Volunteers brought flashlights to weekend searches. But as days slipped toward winter, hope began to feel like something fragile, a light trembling in the wind. Investigators still believed the boys were alive. There was no evidence of the opposite. But belief does not build evidence, and hope alone does not reveal direction. Inside the precinct, the hallway leading to the detective bureau had been slowly papered with photocopies of the boys' faces. Each time someone walked past, the eyes stayed with them. Some officers admitted they avoided that side of the building when they could. It was not guilt, at least not entirely, but the discomfort of confronting a puzzle without edges. Meanwhile, rumors continued to drift through the town like leaves caught in an eddy. A white van near the highway. A suspicious stranger was seen buying rope at a hardware store. A neighbor who claimed to hear voices near the culvert at night. None held up to scrutiny. Witnesses misremembered. Timeline inconsistencies multiplied. Leads evaporated. By late November, the families had organized themselves into their own informal network. They made calls, followed tips, and contacted organizations in neighboring states. They learned which hospitals kept anonymous intake logs and which counties were willing to recheck field reports. In living rooms and church basements, they spread out maps, highlighters, and notebooks. Their grief became its own investigative force. Part prayer, part discipline, and part refusal to let time swallow their sons without resistance. But even determination has limits. By winter, fatigue had carved lines into their faces. Parents aged faster in months than they had in years. Law enforcement was not immune to the same wear. One detective, who had worked the case since hour one, described it as a kind of living stasis. Every morning felt like the same day. Every check led back to the same gap. Every conversation circled the same absence. "You're looking for a shadow with no source," he said. And the longer it goes on, the more the shadow feels like it came from nowhere. Still, they persisted. During December, the department performed a series of coordinated saturation searches around the creek system and the abandoned industrial lots. Cadaver dogs were brought in, not out of certainty, but necessity. Snow fell the night before the search, leaving fresh powder across the ground. Every print left by the officers felt like an intrusion. The dogs swept the area methodically, handlers quiet, breath visible in the cold. Not a single alert, not even a false positive. The search captain knelt beside one of the dogs at the end of the run, resting a hand on its collar, as if hoping it would change its mind. It didn't. By Christmas, the case file had grown to over 500 pages of interviews, maps, phone dumps, background checks, and environmental reports. It was weighty enough to feel like a record of something significant, yet contained nothing definitive. The boys themselves, in contrast, felt like they were dissolving into memory too quickly. Schools held assemblies. Counselors visited classrooms. Their friends were encouraged to talk about them, draw pictures, and write letters. Many did. The letters were placed into a binder for each family, a gesture meant to comfort. Though one mother later said it felt too much like preparing a memorial while pretending it wasn't. January arrived with bitter cold. One by one, investigative resources were reassigned. Search units returned to normal rotation. Detectives resumed older cases. The file, once a daily priority, became an intermittent one, opened only when a new tip came in, or when someone refused to let it rest. Months passed. Seasons changed. The posters in shop windows faded under sunlight. Snow melted. Grass returned. But absence kept its shape. A year after the disappearances, the precinct held a small private meeting to discuss what remained. The sheriff, weary and pragmatic, announced the official statement. The investigation was ongoing, but active search operations were suspended pending new evidence. It was the bureaucratic way of saying, "We don't know what else to do." Families reacted with predictable heartbreak, though none were surprised. Some had expected it long before. Others refused to accept it at all. But all agreed that the worst part was not the announcement. It was the quiet after it. The way phones stopped ringing. The way neighbors stopped checking in. The way even well-meaning people avoided eye contact because they didn't know what to say. Hope becomes its own kind of isolation, one father later wrote in his journal. You keep it alive because it's all you have, but it pushes you further from everyone who no longer carries the weight of it. And yet, in the shadows of fading attention, the first glints of a future clue were already forming. Not in the town, not in the state, not even in the region, but in a place no one had connected to the case. A detail so small it went unnoticed at first. A pattern overlooked. A name misspelled in an unrelated report. A door someone walked past without opening. Something was waiting. Not a resolution, not yet, but the beginning of one. The first thread in a tapestry no one knew existed. The story had gone quiet, but it had not stopped. In the months that followed the initial disappearance, the search for the two missing boys shifted from urgency to endurance, and the families learned in real time what it meant to live inside a widening silence. By winter of 2002, the cold had settled hard across the county. The trees along the rural roads were bare, their branches etched dark against a flat sky, and the last of the volunteer search parties had thinned until only the most persistent remained. Patrol cars passed along gravel roads at slower speeds, windows fogged from the heater vents, deputies staring at the woods, as though any moment a small figure might emerge from the tree line. But no movement ever came. Both households adjusted in different ways. One kept their porch light on every night, a ritual born from hope rather than practicality. The other taped their missing son's school picture to the refrigerator, as though a reminder placed in the center of everyday life might anchor him to the world long enough for someone to find him again. Neighbors brought food, offered prayers, and asked gentle questions that had no gentle answers. As the days passed, the town became a place where the absence of two children was felt in every quiet corner. Investigators pushed forward with renewed intensity through January. They examined school records, phone logs, and the possibility that the boys had left voluntarily. But every lead dissolved. Every theory crumbled under scrutiny. Neither boy had taken clothing. Neither had withdrawn money. Neither had shown signs of planning or contact with anyone dangerous. The investigators relied heavily on a timeline built from small observations: a passing car, a neighbor's front porch light, and the time a father noticed a door left ajar. But those details, no matter how carefully written into the case file, never congealed into something solid. A break in the case remained elusive, a thread just out of reach. By February, the official classification shifted quietly inside the department's database from active missing juvenile to active pending leads. It was a bureaucratic phrase that meant the same people were still working the case, but fewer resources were assigned. The lead detective, a man known for his patience and slow, careful thinking, kept the file on his desk long after others had moved on. He carried it home on weekends, studying maps at his kitchen table while his wife read the newspaper across from him. Sometimes he would press his thumb against a particular road or property line and whisper, almost to himself, "There's something here we're not seeing." But nothing changed. The case remained suspended between search and stasis. The passage of time created a strange duality for the families. Each morning began with a small surge of hope. A phone call, a message, and a report ended with the same hollow quiet. One mother stopped attending church, unable to bear the weight of questions that always followed her inside. The other found herself waking at 3 a.m., long before the sun rose, standing at the kitchen window as though the darkness itself might reveal something the daylight refused to show. Their grief existed not in dramatic scenes, but in slow, persistent habits that reshaped their lives. A father began leaving bowls of food outside at night, convinced that if the boys were wandering the woods, they would need something to eat. A sibling refused to sleep with the bedroom door closed, afraid of the dark for reasons he could not articulate. Local media revisited the story every few weeks. Brief segments aired on the evening news, accompanied by still photographs of the boys' faces, frozen at the age they had disappeared. Reporters stood outside the sheriff's office, speaking about the mystery that had unsettled the community. But as months passed, the coverage became shorter, then occasional, then rare. People stopped expecting answers, though they still lowered their voices whenever the boys' names were spoken. In small towns, the unresolved became part of the landscape. Like an abandoned house, no one wanted to visit, but everyone knew by heart. Spring arrived with the scent of thawing soil and new leaves. Patrols resumed along the lake roads and wooded trails, though no one voiced the hope that had once propelled them. The lead detective drove the two main routes repeatedly, stopping at old pull-offs and forgotten footpaths. He once walked a narrow game trail until the thicket closed around him, standing quietly as the breeze moved the branches overhead. He imagined the boys passing through this same place, perhaps frightened, perhaps taken, perhaps somewhere else entirely. He returned to his car, feeling the familiar weight in his chest, the feeling of missing something essential. By late summer, a year had passed since the first boy disappeared, and nearly that long since the second. The town held a candlelight vigil at the park, where two wooden benches had been placed facing the water. People gathered at twilight, the air warm and still. The flicker of candles reflected off the lake in long golden streaks. Some whispered prayers, others held hands. A local pastor spoke briefly about hope and patience, his voice carrying across the water. Both families stood near the front, their faces illuminated by candlelight. For a few moments, the town felt woven together by the same thread of sorrow, sharp but shared. Yet as the vigil ended, the same problem returned. No new leads, no sightings, no answers. The sheriff's office kept the file open, but after the first year, fewer officers remembered the details. New cases arrived. New emergencies demanded attention. The file, once thick with activity, now gained pages only through administrative updates and annual review notes. One entry, written in the early fall, read simply, "Case unchanged. No additional information available." It was a line that haunted the lead detective who scribbled in the margin, but that doesn't mean nothing happened. The families adjusted to the long ache of waiting. One father began keeping a journal of every dream in which his son appeared, as though the subconscious might offer clues the waking world could not. A mother kept her son's room exactly as it had been, dusting the shelves weekly, opening the window each morning to let in fresh air. On the anniversary of the second disappearance, the families placed flowers along the roadside where the boys were last seen. A few neighbors joined them. Cars slowed as they passed. A deputy watched from a distance, hat in hand. But somewhere beyond the boundaries of their quiet town, beyond the lakes, beyond the forests, beyond the familiar grid of roads, the story was still moving. Not forward in the way anyone expected, not in a way visible to the families who waited, but moving nonetheless. In a different county, in a neighborhood where no one recognized the boys' faces, something had begun to shift. A new lead, small and almost overlooked, was waiting to be discovered behind a door no one had thought to open yet. That door, when finally reached, would hold the answer to where the boys had been for 4 long years. But the path to it was still forming quietly, almost invisibly, in the background. And when it opened, the truth inside would change every assumption the case had been built on, not only about what happened, but about who had been living unnoticed, just a few miles away the entire time. The door opened with the kind of sound no one ever forgets. A dull, reluctant scrape, as if the frame itself had grown used to never moving. The hallway light spilled into the narrow gap, cutting a thin rectangle across the concrete floor. For a heartbeat, no one stepped forward. The detective stood frozen, shoulders tense, waiting for something to move in the dark. The house had already felt wrong from the moment they entered. Curtains drawn in the middle of the day, deadbolts on interior doors, a padlock on the outside of a room that should never have needed one. They had cleared the rest of the small home in careful sweeps, calling out the standard phrases. Police, search warrant. But no one answered. The suspect's car sat outside, keys still in the ignition, as if whoever had driven it had expected to return quickly. Only this door remained. The cold iron of the lock was still warm from the bolt cutters. The lead detective lifted his flashlight and took the first step. The beam cut through dust and stale air, sweeping over bare walls, a thin mattress on the floor, a metal chair, and something else. A shape in the far corner, small and hunched, eyes reacting to the sudden intrusion of light. For a brief second, the room and the years separated like oil and water. The detective saw only a child. Thin arms, too long hair, and a sweatshirt that hung off narrowed shoulders. The boy squinted into the beam and raised one hand, not to shield himself, but with a gesture that looked almost like surrender. Behind him, another figure shifted. Taller, standing slightly in front as if by habit. The second boy's face was older, sharper at the jaw, but his expression carried the same stunned brightness, like someone waking from a dream too fast. The room filled with the sound of breathing that wasn't the officer's. Shallow, uncertain, as if the lungs had forgotten how to take air without fear. "It's okay," the detective said, his voice more gentle than he expected. "You're safe. We're police." The words seemed to hang in the air, unfamiliar. The younger boy's eyes widened, traveling from the badge on his chest to the radio at his shoulder to the gun at his hip. He took a tiny step back until his shoulders touched the wall. The older one didn't move. He simply watched, gaze flickering between each officer, as if counting them. "Are you hurt?" another voice asked from the doorway. No answer. The older boy's lips parted, then closed again, as though the effort of speech was something he had to remember how to do. "I think," the detective began, then stopped. In his pocket, folded and worn at the edges, lay 2 photographs he had stared at for years. 2 boys smiling at a summer barbecue, one with a gap in his teeth, the other with a baseball cap turned backwards. For a moment, image and reality struggled to line up. These faces were older, thinned out by time, with shadows under their eyes and hair grown out and uneven. But the shapes were there. The slope of the nose, the faint birthmark along the jaw. The detective reached slowly into his jacket, careful not to make any sudden movement. He unfolded one of the photos and held it up. "Is this you?" he asked. The older boy blinked. His gaze moved from the paper to the man's face and back again. Then, very slowly, he nodded. It was not the triumphant moment the headlines would later describe. No one shouted. No one cried out in relief. The room was too small for that, too heavy with air that had gone stale from waiting. Instead, there was a kind of quiet collapse inside each adult present. A tightening in the throat, a sting at the back of the eyes. The impossible had just stepped into the light, and it looked thinner, more fragile than imagination had allowed. Radios crackled in the hallway, voices overlapping. Units called for. Paramedics were requested. The detective spoke into his shoulder mic with a steady tone that didn't match the way his hands trembled. "We have 2 juveniles located. Alive. Repeat, alive. Request immediate medical and transport." Behind him, one of the younger officers swallowed hard, his jaw working. He had joined the department the year after the boys disappeared. Their names had been training material. The case a cautionary lesson about how fast a community could lose 2 children. Now they were standing in front of him, less than 30 feet from the sidewalk where neighbors had walked dogs and pushed strollers for 4 years, never knowing what lay behind this one locked door. The paramedics arrived within minutes, equipment clattering against the narrow hallway walls. They knelt on the concrete, voices soft. "We're here to help you, okay? We're going to check your heart and your blood pressure. That's all." The younger boy flinched at the touch of the blood pressure cuff, eyes darting to the older one, as if asking permission. A small, almost imperceptible nod came in return. It was clear long before the medical report that whatever had happened in this room, a hierarchy had formed. The older had become the protector by default, standing slightly in front, answering questions first, and watching every stranger for signs of threat. "Do you know how old you are?" a paramedic asked him gently. He hesitated. His eyes shifted to a corner of the room where a pencil mark scarred the wall at shoulder height, several others lined up beneath it, uneven, scratched into paint. For a moment his hand lifted slightly, as if to measure himself by habit. 12, he said finally. The paramedic glanced at the detective, eyebrows lifting. The file said he should have been 12 3 years ago. Time had passed on calendars and in court dockets, but in this room it had moved differently, measured not by birthdays, but by tallies on a wall. As they were escorted out, blinking against the sudden brightness of the world, blankets draped over their shoulders, the street erupted into a quiet chaos. Patrol cars, an ambulance, and the grainy shapes of neighbors watching from behind curtains, drawn by the flash of red and blue. News would not break for hours yet, but the atmosphere had shifted already. People could feel it in the air, that electric charge that comes when a story everyone thought had ended returns for one more chapter. At the hospital, staff cleared a small wing, pulling curtains around beds and assigning security at the doors. The boys were examined, weighed, and their vital signs monitored. They were underfed, dehydrated, but alive. No immediate injuries, no broken bones, no open wounds. The harm lay elsewhere, woven into habits and silences. When a nurse asked if they wanted anything to eat, the younger one whispered, "Cereal," as if unsure whether the word was allowed. The older one asked for nothing. He sat upright in the bed, eyes fixed on the doorway, listening to every footstep that approached. In the conference room down the hall, The detective laid the old case file on the table and opened a new one beside it. The first contained photographs of birthday parties, school portraits, and a police sketch of a possible suspect that had never been confirmed. The new file would hold medical reports, fresh interviews, and the questions that now crowded every available space. Who had turned that lock from the outside? How had the boys survived for 4 years without anyone noticing the patterns of coming and going at this house? How many times had officers driven past this address, unaware of the thin wall that separated them from the missing children on their lists? The suspect, picked up less than an hour later several blocks away, offered little in his first statements. He watched the detectives carefully, weighing his answers, framing his story as something between rescue and necessity. He claimed the boys had been in danger elsewhere, that he had given them shelter, and that the locked door had been for their own good. The detectives listened and recorded every word, knowing that whatever narrative he built would have to be dismantled carefully, for now the priority was not him. It was the 2 beds down the hall, the 2 names that had been spoken in past tense for 4 years and now needed to be shifted awkwardly back into the present. That change would not be simple. Lives had grown around their absence like scar tissue. Families had learned to live with a kind of unfinished grief that did not know where to place itself. The news of their discovery would move through those homes like a sudden storm, tearing away some structures while leaving others standing. Before any of that could happen, one more step remained. Phones had to be picked up, numbers dialed, voices composed. Somewhere, under a different roof, parents were about to hear words they had rehearsed only in dreams or nightmares. We found them. They're alive. The detective stared at the receiver for a long moment before lifting it. The day after the boys were found, the small mountain town where their rescue took place woke to an unusual quiet, the kind that follows the passing of a storm. Snow still clung to rooftops, melting in thin lines that traced the edge of gutters, and for a moment the world felt suspended, as if time itself hesitated out of respect for what had unfolded behind that ordinary apartment door less than 24 hours earlier. Inside the sheriff's office, deputies moved with subdued purpose, their voices low, their steps light, as though a louder noise might break something fragile in the air. For people who had worked countless cases, some ending well and many not, this one carried a weight unlike the rest. A weight built from the impossible collision of loss and survival, from the realization that the boys had been living only miles away, passing through the same streets deputies had driven for years, unseen and unrecognized. The older boy sat with a medic for most of the morning. He kept his arms folded across his chest, not from defiance but from habit, as if protecting a space that had been his only certainty for too long. He spoke little, answering questions with short nods or small, halting phrases. The younger boy clung to a blanket someone had wrapped around his shoulders the night before. He asked when his parents would arrive, and every few minutes he repeated the same question in the same small voice, as if repetition might make the reality feel less unreal. Soon, deputies kept telling him. They're on their way. In the hallway, the lead investigator leaned against the wall, rubbing his temples in slow circles. His mind replayed the moment the door opened, the dim interior, and the 2 faces looking back at him with a kind of stunned stillness. For months he had reviewed dead-end tips, followed distant leads, and stared at maps that never resolved into answers. Now, suddenly, impossibly, there they were, 2 boys pulled from the blank space of years. He knew the case wasn't over. Not really. Not yet. A rescue was only the start of another, more delicate search. The search for understanding, for context, for truth that could be spoken without causing further harm. When the parents arrived later that morning, escorted by deputies through the back entrance to avoid the waiting reporters, the building seemed to exhale. The father of the older boy walked stiffly, gripping the railing as if unsure whether his legs could carry him the rest of the way. The mother had no such hesitation. She moved quickly, the way someone moves when years of waiting compress into a single instant. The reunion took place in a small conference room. There were no cameras, no statements, and no staged embraces for the public. Just a plain table, two chairs pushed aside, and the quiet breath of a family crossing a threshold they had once been told they might never reach again. The mother stepped forward first. For a heartbeat, the boy didn't react, his expression blank with uncertainty, as though his memories and his reality had not yet caught up to each other. Then something in her voice, a tremor, a familiar cadence softened by tears, broke through the wall time had built. His face changed. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered in the space between them. She closed it gently between both of hers. No words were needed. Not then. The father joined a moment later, placing a trembling hand on the back of his son's head, pulling him close in a gesture both protective and fragile. In the hallway, deputies looked away, giving the family privacy even though the door was still open. Some leaned against the wall, blinking hard. Others simply stood still, caught between relief and the strange ache that comes when something impossible becomes real. The younger boy's parents arrived shortly afterward. His reunion was different. Faster, louder, the kind of embrace that collapses years into seconds. He buried his face against his mother's coat and did not let go for a long time. Outside, reporters gathered behind the barricades, shouting questions that deputies ignored. "Are the boys okay? What happened inside that apartment? How long were they kept?" The sheriff stepped out once, held up a hand, and offered only one line: "They're safe now." That was all he was willing to say. All he felt should be said. Back inside, victim services counselors set up in adjoining rooms, preparing for the long process ahead. The lead investigator knew that what came next would require patience, gentleness, and an understanding that answers might come slowly, if at all. Children surviving years in confinement did not unfold their stories like clean timelines. They revealed fragmented images, sounds, and routine shards of memory that experts would spend months helping them sort. Still, every official who walked those halls that day understood the miracle they had witnessed. Not the miracle of justice. Justice was still uncertain, still forming in paperwork and courtrooms, but the miracle of presence. Two boys once reduced to photocopied flyers and fading hope were alive, sitting in rooms warmed by sunlight instead of shadows. The older boy was the first to speak after the reunion. It happened quietly, almost accidentally, when a counselor placed a cup of water in front of him. His mother sat nearby, her hand resting lightly on his chair. He stared at the cup for a few seconds, then whispered, "Do I have to go back?" The counselor knelt beside him. "No," she said gently. "You're not going back. You're safe." He nodded once, but tears slipped down his cheeks anyway. Silent, unbidden streaks of grief and relief tangled together. Across the hall, the younger boy sat curled against his father, exhausted from crying and clinging. He held a small toy someone had given him earlier that morning, turning it over in his hands again and again like a talisman. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the building's heating system and the faint chatter of radios from down the hall. Outside, snowflakes drifted slowly from a pale sky. The town moved at its usual pace, unaware that inside a modest brick building, two families were learning how to breathe again. It would take months for the full truth to come out. Months of interviews, evaluations, court hearings, and careful therapeutic sessions. But in those first few hours, none of that mattered. What mattered was the simple, extraordinary fact of presence. The boys were here, alive, found behind a door everyone had passed by without seeing. And in the quiet aftermath of that discovery, the world felt just a little wider, as though hope had found space again, where logic once insisted there was none. In the months that followed the identification, the official narrative settled into its own kind of silence, the kind that grows around cases where the truth arrives in fragments rather than declarations. Investigators on both sides of the state line exchanged files, piecing together the 4 intervening years with the patience of archivists handling brittle paper. It was slow work, methodical, and much of it unresolved. But what they could reconstruct pointed toward a pattern that felt less like disappearance and more like absorption, a boy taken into a life that had narrowed so gradually he no longer recognized the borders. While agencies built timelines, the small community that had once searched fields and creek beds began hearing the news through neighbors and local broadcasts. For some it was relief, for others disbelief, but for most it was something harder to name, a feeling close to awe that in a world of unfinished endings, one thread had finally found its way back. Parents who had helped in the searches paused longer at the headlines. Teachers remembered the quiet boy who always sat near the window. A clerk who had once told investigators he didn't recall seeing anything found himself standing at the counter staring into nothing, replaying faces from years before. In households across the county, people spoke softly about it at dinner tables, not because it was frightening, but because it had become a story shaped by tenderness rather than tragedy. For the families at the center of it, life did not return to normal. It reshaped itself around new routines that were fragile, tentative, and built on the understanding that reunion was not a simple undoing of absence. One family filled their home carefully, reintroducing small things: a familiar blanket folded at the foot of a bed, a photograph placed quietly on a desk, a lamp turned on in a hallway at dusk. Soft and steady, conversations came slowly. Some days were filled with long stretches of quiet where no one pushed for answers and no one explained the missing time. Other days held glimmers of recognition when a gesture or familiar phrase bridged the years. The parents learned to measure progress not in milestones, but in moments: a longer glance, a more anchored smile, the soft murmur of a name spoken without hesitation. Nights were the hardest. The house had changed in the years of waiting. Bedrooms had been repainted, furniture replaced, and habits formed around emptiness. And now, in that same space, steps moved down the hall again. Sometimes the mother woke before dawn and stood in the doorway of the newly rebuilt room, watching her child breathe, not to check on safety, but simply to relearn the shape of having him home. Parallel to this, detectives returned again and again to the door that had changed everything. In reports and interviews, they reconstructed that moment not as a triumph, but as a lesson. They described how ordinary the entrance had looked, how it could have belonged to anyone, and how a single knock had pressed time into motion. One investigator wrote later that he remembered the pause more than the discovery. The few seconds where he waited for the door to open, wondering what they would find, wondering what absence could become when given 4 years. The procedural notes captured the facts. What they did not capture was the texture of the moment, the air in the hallway, the hush in the room behind him, and the quiet recognition that stories do not always end where evidence says they should. The officers who stood in that corridor found themselves revisiting the memory in unexpected moments, as if trying to understand what it had meant to stand between disappearance and return. The legal and institutional follow-through moved slowly and without fanfare. Interviews were conducted. Records were examined. Across agencies, professionals debated what could have been done differently, where systems had held, where they had not, and why the lines between missing, runaway, and hidden remained so porous. Seminars were organized, and case studies were reviewed. Some departments added new protocols, small adjustments in policy that most people would never notice, but which officers hoped would widen the margins of recognition in future cases. One note circulated widely: look longer, ask twice, and assume that silence may not be a choice, but a circumstance. Meanwhile, the children involved began the delicate process of re-entering worlds that had grown without them. School counselors worked quietly behind the scenes. Teachers prepared materials in case gradual reintegration became possible. None of them rushed it. They understood that a life lived in the shadow of disappearance reshapes itself differently than a life lived in routine. Therapists specializing in trauma and developmental adjustment met with the families, explaining gently that healing would unfold not in a straight line but in elliptical patterns. Moments of connection followed by retreat, calm days followed by echoes of old fears. The parents listened with patience, having already learned over the years that love often required waiting without understanding. For the siblings, the aftermath brought its own learning curve. They had grown up in households marked by a quiet routine shaped around absence. Porch lights kept burning, birthdays observed with empty chairs, and holidays softened by unspoken hope. Now, presence changed the equation. Some felt relief, others felt confusion. A few experienced guilt, questioning whether they had grown too accustomed to life without the missing child. Counselors helped them navigate the shifting dynamics, teaching them to recognize that reunion, like grief, required room to breathe. The communities surrounding the families began holding small vigils not for the missing, but for the found. They lit candles along porches, left handwritten notes on doorsteps, and planted trees in schoolyards as living reminders of endurance. These gestures were not grand or loud. They echoed the same quiet persistence that had carried the families through the years. One neighbor left a lantern on their porch every night, even after the family had extinguished theirs, saying softly, "Some lights are meant to burn for more than one home." Investigators who had once stood in front of cameras providing updates now stepped back, allowing the story to settle into the private spaces where healing begins. A detective who had been among the first on the scene wrote a final note in the case file before marking it resolved. Time did not erase them. It only hid them until we looked again. It was not procedural language, but it remained. No one removed it. As spring moved toward summer, the families spent more afternoons outdoors. Walks became part of the routine. Slow ones at first, then longer, following familiar streets, passing places that had once been landmarks in the search. With each step, they reclaimed the geography of worry as the geography of home. In one backyard, 2 chairs were placed side by side beneath a tree, their placement unchanged from the years of waiting. Now, both were occupied. In the days that followed the rescue, the world outside moved faster than the people inside the story could keep up with. Reporters clustered at the edge of the cordoned-off street, microphones raised toward windows that stayed shut. Cars idled in front of the apartment where the boys had stepped back into the light, each driver hoping to glimpse something that might explain the impossible. But inside the station, behind an unmarked hallway and a door that officers kept gently closed, the pace was slower, measured, and shaped by the careful work of people who understood that the human mind does not return on command. The 2 boys sat in separate rooms, each with a blanket wrapped around their shoulders, each with a cup of water they held but rarely drank. They were given time, warmth, and silence. Things that had been rationed in the years before, and slowly the fragments of their missing years began to surface in ways that investigators did not expect. Not in long stories or coherent timelines, not in dramatic confessions or cinematic recountings, but in small details that appeared like scattered pieces of a map no one had ever drawn. A gesture toward a closed door, a flinch at the sight of a stranger's shadow. A quiet question was asked not to clarify memory, but to confirm existence. "Is it still the same year?" one of them murmured to a deputy, as though time itself had lost its meaning behind the walls they had lived in. Detectives pieced together what they could from these fragments. A room kept dim, even in daylight, a mattress on the floor, a handful of books, some missing pages. Meals were left outside the door on nights when the man they lived with wanted silence. Other nights when he sat too close, speaking too softly, asking the same questions until the boys answered in the way he liked. There had been kindness, sometimes. Movies, a walk to a corner store, and a meal from a restaurant. And these moments made the story harder to hold, and the lines more difficult to draw between survival and fear. Trauma, the department psychologist explained, is not a clean narrative. It folds memory in strange ways, protecting the mind even as it bruises it. What mattered most now was not the chronology, but the fact that they were here, alive, speaking in voices that shook but did not break. Families were brought to the station separately. They were prepared gently and warned that the boys might hesitate, might not remember faces or names immediately, and might react with confusion before recognition. But when the first mother stepped into that plain room with the metal table and the humming fluorescent light, the distance between years collapsed in a single breath. The boy lifted his head. His eyes moved slowly along the lines of her face, searching for something buried in the quietest part of memory. And when he found it, when the familiarity finally surfaced, his expression shifted in a way that no camera outside could ever capture. He whispered a name he had not spoken in years. She did not rush to him and did not smother him with relief. Instead, she reached out one hand and touched his sleeve lightly, as though touching a bird afraid to land. "You're home," she said. "You're really home." In the next room, the second reunion unfolded in similarly fragile, hesitant fragments. A father who had aged too quickly. A boy who had grown taller but still held himself as though waiting for permission to move. Words came slowly, then more easily, then stopped altogether as both paused to feel the weight of the moment. Outside the station, the world reacted with disbelief, relief, outrage, and fascination. Emotions that swirl quickly in the vacuum where explanations should be. News anchors called it a miracle. Headlines framed it as a story of heroism and perseverance. But inside the halls of the department, the mood was quieter and more complicated. Officers who had carried the boys out of that apartment stayed late at their desks, reading reports not because protocol required it, but because they needed to understand how something so seemingly calm from the outside could conceal so much harm within. Some found themselves replaying the moment the door opened, how ordinary it looked, and how nothing in that hallway signaled the enormity of what lay beyond it. One deputy later wrote in his notebook, "Evil is rarely loud. Sometimes it moves like dust in the corners of a room." As interviews continued, a fuller picture emerged, not dramatic, not sensational, but devastating in its plainness. The man who had taken them had kept routines that mimicked normalcy just closely enough to make the boy's disappearance seem more impossible than it already was. He had held a job, chatted politely with neighbors, paid rent on time, bought groceries and small gifts, all while hiding two boys behind a door painted the same color as every other door in the building. It was the ordinariness that unsettled investigators most, the way a quiet face can hide a storm, the way a locked door can hold years without making a sound. In the legal offices across town, preparations for charges began with equal measures of urgency and restraint. Prosecutors reviewed every detail, knowing that was the story the public wanted. One of justice, swift and absolute, was not the story the boys were ready to tell. Cases involving prolonged disappearance and psychological coercion require careful steps, not because the truth is unclear, but because the trauma is. Each decision had to account for their well-being first, evidence second. The system, long criticized for overlooking nuance, found itself moving slowly out of necessity. Over the next few days, the boys were transferred to a safe, undisclosed location. Specialists arrived, trauma counselors, medical professionals, and victim advocates. Their role was not to extract information but to build stability where none had existed for years. The boys slept deeply, often for hours longer than expected, their bodies responding to the absence of threat. They woke, disoriented sometimes, asking whether the man would come back, whether they had done something wrong, and whether they were allowed to open the door to the hallway. Each reassurance was gentle, repeated as many times as needed. "You're safe now. You're free to walk where you want. No one here will hurt you." Outside, the town held vigils. Families lit candles at porches where lights had burned for years. People brought flowers to the police department steps. Strangers sent letters. Some prayed. Others simply stood in silence. The story didn't end their fear, but it shifted it. If such a thing could happen in an ordinary neighborhood, then perhaps vigilance itself needed to be ordinary too. And through all of this, the boys remained at the center. Not symbols, not miracles, but human beings slowly stepping out of the long shadow of absence into the fragile, uncertain shape of a future that finally had room for them. In the months after the reunion, The house on the quiet cul-de-sac still looked the same from the outside. Same porch, same hedges, same afternoon light pooling across the yard. But inside, everything had shifted, as though the air itself had loosened after holding tension for too many years. The rooms that had once felt frozen with furniture arranged around absence and hallways shaped by worry now carried the sound of footsteps again. Not loud ones, not confident ones, but real ones. 2 sets, sometimes 3. The boys moved through the house cautiously at first, as if relearning the geometry of home. Their habits had been shaped by years behind a locked door, years under someone else's routine, and years of silence and measured permission. So, the small freedoms came slowly, standing in the kitchen without asking, opening a window, choosing which shirt to wear, leaving a light on without consequence. Each action was its own quiet victory, the kind that didn't require celebration, only patience. Their parents watched with the cautious hope of people who understood that recovery wasn't a single moment, but a long corridor lined with doors that opened on their own time. Some days the boys spoke easily, describing the meals they liked or the music they remembered. Other days, they retreated into silence, overwhelmed by the noise of a world that had moved on without them. Their mother learned not to press. Their father learned to sit with them in the quiet, offering presence instead of expectation. Investigators visited occasionally, not to pry, but to make sure systems had done what they needed to do. The case was formally closed, but no one pretended that closure was clean. Too much time had passed. Too many unanswered questions remained. Why had it happened? How had it been allowed to continue? Who else might have been missed? Those questions belonged to a larger world, one built of policies, blind spots, and overburdened procedures. But inside the house, none of that mattered as much as the simplest truth. The boys were home, alive, breathing, present. Their rooms were rearranged slowly. One boy asked for his old posters again, not the originals. They were long gone, but new ones that looked like them. He stared at them for a long time before taping them to the wall, as if memorizing the fact that they now belonged to him again. The other boy spent hours flipping through photo albums their mother had kept intact over the years, his fingers tracing the edges of each picture, as though searching for clues. Sometimes he paused on a photo and whispered, "I remember this." Sometimes he didn't remember at all. Both were acceptable answers. Therapists became part of their weekly rhythm. So did long walks around the neighborhood, slowly extending the distance each time. At first, neighbors watched from their yards, unsure how to greet children who had returned from a place most people couldn't imagine. Eventually, recognition softened into welcome, a wave from the mailbox. A small gift was left on the porch, a casserole delivered with no note. In towns like these, kindness had always been measured in gestures rather than declarations. Months turned into a year, then another. The boys grew taller. Their voices deepened. They learned to ride bikes again, though neither liked going too far. They slept with the hall light on. They sat close to each other at dinner. Small things, all of them, but each one chipped away at the shadow of the years they'd lost. Healing wasn't linear. It was more like a tide, sometimes pulling forward, sometimes drawing back, and always returning in slow, steady waves. The lead investigator kept a framed copy of the final case summary on his desk, not out of pride, but as a reminder of the fragile line between disappearance and discovery. He read it often, not to relive the fear, but to remember the importance of small details, small choices, and small moments of attention. The kind that, 4 years earlier, had led to a door being opened at the right second, revealing 2 boys who had been waiting behind it for far too long. Every July, the family visited a quiet trail outside town where a memorial bench overlooked a small clearing. It had once been a place of searching, a spot where volunteers had gathered with maps and radios and flashlights. Now it was simply peaceful. They sat there together, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. The boys did not always understand the ritual, but they sensed its weight, its meaning. The bench was not for grief anymore. It was for gratitude. One autumn evening, as the leaves began to turn and the air carried its first cool edge, the boy's mother placed a small lantern on the kitchen windowsill. It was nothing dramatic, just a soft, steady glow that filled the room with warm light. She didn't explain its purpose out loud. She didn't need to. Light had always been a symbol in this house, a promise, a signal, a reminder that darkness, however deep, was not permanent. As the light flickered across the room, the boys sat at the table and watched it, their faces calm. They didn't say much. They rarely did. But for the first time in years, the silence wasn't something to fear. It was simply part of the room, part of the evening, and part of their story. Not every mystery ends with every question answered. Not every disappearance ends in tragedy. Sometimes, against all odds, the world gives someone back. Not perfectly, not unchanged, but here, present, alive, and sometimes that has to be enough. If stories like this move you, stories of absence, rediscovery, and the fragile threads that pull people home, then I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're watching from. Share this story so others remember that every missing name still carries a heartbeat, and every light left burning matters.